The morning mist was still clinging to the valley floor when I walked out onto the porch of Cielo Alto. It is the time of day I love the most, when the air smells of wet earth and ripening grapes, and the only sound is the distant call of a hawk circling the currents. My name is Beatrice Rossi, and for 40 years I chased headlines and corruption as an investigative journalist in San Francisco. But now, my world is defined by these 20 acres of vines. I held my coffee cup with both hands and let the warmth seep into my arthritic fingers while I surveyed the land that has been in the Rossi family for 3 generations. Everything was in its place. The vines were heavy with fruit, and the soil was dark and rich, and the old oak tree by the gate stood guard, just as it had when I was a little girl. But then the silence was broken. It started as a low hum in the distance and grew into a mechanical growl that echoed off the hills. I squinted down the long gravel driveway and saw a cloud of dust rising like smoke. A car was approaching, and it was moving far too fast for a dirt road. It was a bright red convertible that looked like an open wound against the soft greens and browns of the landscape. I felt a tightening in my chest, not of fear, but of annoyance, because my sanctuary was being invaded. The car skidded to a halt near the barn, and the engine died with a final aggressive roar. I stayed on the porch and watched as the driver's door opened. A man stepped out and smoothed down the front of a suit that I knew cost more than my tractor. He adjusted his sunglasses and looked around with an air of ownership that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was Elias Thorne, my nephew. My late sister's boy had not visited me in over 2 years, not since he asked for a loan to start a cryptocurrency business that vanished into thin air. I watched him walk toward the house, and my reporter's instinct kicked in immediately. He walked with a bounce in his step, but his shoulders were tight, and he kept patting the breast pocket of his jacket as if checking for something valuable. He was sweating despite the cool morning air. "Aunt Bea," he called out, and his voice was too loud and too cheerful. He took off his sunglasses to reveal eyes that were shifting everywhere except looking at me. He bounded up the porch steps and pulled me into a hug that smelled of expensive cologne and stale cigarette smoke. I stiffened, but let him embrace me. "Elias," I said calmly, stepping back to look at him. "This is a surprise. I didn't know you were in the area." He laughed a nervous sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, you know me, Bea. I just wanted to check on my favorite aunt. A man can't visit his family without an appointment, can he?" I studied him. His shoes were polished leather, totally unsuitable for a farm, and there was a thin sheen of perspiration on his upper lip. He looked like a man running from something, or perhaps running towards something with desperate intent. "You are welcome to visit Elias," I said, "but you missed breakfast. I have already eaten." He waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, I am not hungry. I just wanted to see the place. It looks fantastic. Bea, really fantastic. Prime real estate." That phrase, prime real estate, hit my ears like a sour note on a piano. People who love the land don't call it real estate. They call it home or soil or legacy. "Come inside," I said, opening the screen door. "I will make some tea." As he followed me into the kitchen, I noticed his eyes darting around the room, scanning the countertops and the mantelpiece. He wasn't looking at the family photos or the fresh flowers I had cut yesterday. He was looking at the piles of paperwork on my desk in the corner. "So, how have you been keeping up with all this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the house. "It is a lot of work for one person, especially at your age." "I am 72. Elias, not invalid," I said, filling the kettle. "And I have help during the harvest." Of course," he said quickly. "But still, it must be lonely out here." So far from the city. So far from help if something happens. I turned to face him, and I saw the calculation in his face. He wasn't here to catch up. He was here for a reason, and my gut told me it had nothing to do with family affection. I remembered the way he used to lie when he was a child, how he would smile the widest right before he broke something. "I am perfectly fine here, Elias," I said steadily. "This is my home." He smiled again, but his jaw was tight. "Well, maybe we should talk about that. I have some ideas, Bea. Great ideas that could make your life so much easier." I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the drafty farmhouse. The wolf was in the hen house, and he was wearing a tailored suit. The evening settled over the vineyard like a heavy purple blanket, and I busied myself in the kitchen to keep my hands occupied. I had roasted a chicken with rosemary and lemon, which was a recipe my mother taught me 50 years ago. And the scent usually brought me comfort, but tonight it felt stifling. Elias sat at the small wooden table in the corner, and he was nursing a glass of my best Cabernet Sauvignon, but he was drinking it like water rather than savoring it. I watched him from the reflection in the window above the sink, and I saw him check his watch 3 times in the span of 5 minutes. I brought the platter to the table and set it down between us, and the steam rose up in the quiet room. Elias forced a smile that showed too many teeth and picked up his fork, but he didn't eat. He just pushed the potatoes around his plate and stared at the centerpiece I had arranged. I served myself a small portion and waited because I knew the silence would force him to speak. In my years of interviewing politicians and criminals, I learned that if you stay quiet long enough, people will eventually fill the void with the truth, or at least a lie that reveals the truth. "This is delicious, Bea," he said finally, but his voice was tight. "You really do everything yourself out here, don't you? Cooking and cleaning and managing the vines." "It keeps me young," I replied, taking a sip of water. "Hard work is good for the soul, Elias. You used to know that when you were a boy helping your father in the garage." He flinched slightly at the mention of his father. "That was a long time ago," he said, waving his fork in the air. "Times change, Bea. The world moves faster now, and people our age? People your age shouldn't have to work this hard. You have earned a rest." I put my fork down slowly and looked him directly in the eyes. "I am not tired, Elias. Why are you so concerned about my workload all of a sudden?" He leaned forward, and his eyes widened with feigned sincerity. "Because I worry about you. I was driving up here thinking about how isolated you are. What if you fall? What if there is a fire? You are out here all alone, miles from the nearest hospital. It is not safe." I listened to the cadence of his voice and recognized the rehearsed rhythm of a sales pitch. He wasn't speaking from the heart, he was reciting a script he had practiced in the mirror. "I have neighbors," I said calmly. "The Millers are just down the road, and I have a cell phone. I am hardly stranded on a desert island. But why risk it?" He pressed, and his voice rose slightly in pitch. "Listen, Bea, I have been doing some research, just looking around, for your benefit. There is this incredible place called Silver Creek Sanctuary, just outside of San Francisco. It is not a nursing home. It is a luxury lifestyle community." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Silver Creek Sanctuary. The name sounded like a funeral parlor. "They have heated pools and gourmet dining and staff on call 24 hours a day," he continued, and the words were tumbling out of him now. "You wouldn't have to lift a finger. No more pruning vines in the cold. No more fixing leaky roofs. You could just relax and enjoy your golden years." "And what would happen to Cielo Alto?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low. Elias paused and took a large gulp of wine. "Well, that is the beauty of it. The market is hot right now, Bea. Incredibly hot. I know some developers who are looking for exactly this kind of soil quality. If you sell now, you could afford the best suite at Silver Creek and still have millions left over. You would be rich. I stared at him, and suddenly, the image of the little boy I used to babysit vanished completely. Sitting across from me was a desperate man who saw my home not as a legacy, but as a pile of poker chips. He didn't care about my safety or my golden years. He cared about the commission or the cut he would get from the sale. I am already rich. Elias, I said softly. I have this land. I have my memories. I have my wine. I don't need a heated pool, and I certainly don't need to be managed by a nursing staff. He slammed his glass down a little too hard, and wine sloshed onto the tablecloth, leaving a stain that looked like blood. You are being stubborn, he snapped, and the mask of the caring nephew slipped for a fraction of a second. You are sitting on a gold mine, and you are treating it like a vegetable garden. It is selfish, Bea. Selfish, I repeated, and the word hung in the air between us. He realized his mistake immediately and tried to backtrack. I mean, you are denying yourself a better life. I just want what is best for you. I picked up my napkin and dabbed at the corners of my mouth. I think I know what is best for me, Elias, and right now, what is best is for me to clear these dishes. We can discuss your concern for my well-being in the morning. I stood up and began clearing the table, and I could feel his eyes boring into my back. He didn't offer to help. He just sat there, staring at the empty bottle of wine, and I knew that this was far from over. He hadn't driven all this way just to be told no over a roast chicken. He had a plan, and my refusal was just an obstacle he intended to remove. I did not sleep well that night. The silence of the house usually comforted me, but now it felt heavy and pregnant with unseen threats. I lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old timber frame, wondering if the sounds were just the wind, or if they were the footsteps of a man pacing in the guest room down the hall. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through my curtains, I abandoned the pretense of sleep and rose. I dressed in silence and pulled on my thick wool cardigan against the morning chill and made my way downstairs. My feet knew every squeaky floorboard by heart, so I moved like a ghost through my own home. I paused outside the guest room door and listened. I could hear the rhythmic heavy breathing of Elias, and it was a sound of deep, untroubled sleep. It made my blood boil to think that he could sleep so soundly after trying to dismantle my life over a roast chicken dinner, while I had spent the night staring at the ceiling. I moved past his door and headed straight for my study, which is a small room at the back of the house that overlooks the north vineyard. The study was my command center. It was where I kept the history of Cielo Alto recorded in ink and paper. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and reached for the bottom drawer on the right side. This was where I kept the farm's operating ledger, which was a thick black book where I recorded every expense and every sale and every harvest yield for the last 10 years. I needed to see the numbers in black and white to remind myself that this farm was profitable and that I was not the charity case Elias was trying to paint me as. I pulled the handle, but the drawer slid open too easily. It lacked the usual resistance of the heavy book pressing against the wood. I looked down, and my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The drawer was empty. I froze. I am a creature of habit. Beatrice Rossi does not misplace things. I stared into the empty wooden space and felt a cold flush of violation. I checked the other drawers and I checked the top of the desk, and I even got down on my hands and knees to look under the chair. It was gone. I sat back on my heels and tried to think. I had used it 2 days ago to log the purchase of new irrigation tubing. I had put it back exactly where it belonged. Then I remembered yesterday morning. I had been in the garden for 2 hours, pruning the rose bushes by the front gate. Elias had arrived while I was out there. He had been alone in the house for at least 20 minutes before I came in to make tea. I stood up and walked to the window. The sun was just cresting the hills and painting the vines in gold, but the beauty was lost on me. I looked down toward the side of the barn, where we kept the large recycling and trash bins. Something white caught my eye. It was a flutter of paper caught in the weeds near the metal cans. I left the study and walked out the back door, moving quickly across the damp grass. The morning air was sharp and bit at my exposed skin, but I didn't feel it. I reached the trash area and looked into the main bin. My stomach turned over. There it was, my ledger. But it wasn't just thrown away. It had been mutilated. The spine was broken and the pages had been ripped out in savage clumps. I reached in and pulled out a handful of the debris. I saw my own handwriting documenting the 2018 vintage, which was our best year in a decade, torn in half and stained with coffee grounds. He had destroyed it. He hadn't just looked at it, he had actively destroyed the record of my competence. I understood the game immediately. He wanted to claim I was losing my mind. If I couldn't find my ledger, I couldn't prove the farm's finances. If I couldn't prove the finances, he could claim the farm was failing. He was manufacturing a crisis that only he could solve. I stood there by the trash cans, trembling with a rage I hadn't felt since my days in the newsroom when I uncovered a cover-up. I wanted to march upstairs and throw these torn pages in his face. I wanted to scream at him to get out of my house and off my land. But I stopped myself. I took a deep breath and let the cold air fill my lungs. If I confronted him now, he would deny it. He would say I must have thrown it out by mistake in a fit of dementia. He would use my anger as proof of my instability. No, I could not give him that satisfaction. I carefully placed the torn pages back into the bin and covered them with a discarded newspaper to hide them. I wiped my hands on my jeans and smoothed down my hair. I needed to be smarter than him. I needed to be the Beatrice Rossi who took down corrupt senators and mob bosses. I walked back to the house and entered the kitchen. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, and the familiar whistle would be his wake-up call. I would make him breakfast. I would smile. I would play the part of the confused old aunt who couldn't remember where she put her glasses. I would let him think he was winning, because the man who thinks he has won is the man who stops looking over his shoulder. And that is exactly when I would catch him. Playing the role of a senile old woman was the most exhausting work I had done in decades. All day I had wandered through my own house with a vague smile plastered on my face while pretending to forget where I kept the spoons and asking Elias the same questions over and over again. I watched him smirk behind my back, and I saw the contempt in his eyes every time I fumbled with my keys. It took every ounce of my self-control not to slap that arrogant look off his face, but I held my ground. By the time I climbed into bed at 10 o'clock, my muscles ached from the tension of holding back my rage. I lay in the dark, staring at the shadows, casting long fingers across the ceiling. Sleep was impossible because my mind was racing through the possibilities. Why was he so desperate? Why destroy the ledger? There had to be someone else involved, because Elias was not smart enough to pull off a complex real estate fraud on his own. He was the front man, but I needed to know who was pulling the strings. It was just past 2 in the morning when I heard it. The old farmhouse settles at night and groans like a ship at sea, but this sound was different. It was the low, rhythmic murmur of a voice. I sat up slowly, and the springs of my mattress creaked, and I froze, holding my breath for 10 seconds, until I was sure he hadn't heard me. The voice continued, and it was coming from the guest room down the hall. I slid out of bed, and my bare feet made no sound on the rug. I moved to my bedside table and opened the drawer very slowly. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was my old Sony dictaphone. It was a relic from the 90s with a cassette tape inside, but it had never failed me. I pressed the check battery button and saw the tiny red light flicker to life. It was ready. I crept into the hallway, and the air was cold and smelled of floor wax and old dust. I stayed close to the wall where the floorboards were less likely to squeak. The voice grew louder as I approached his door. Elias was pacing. I could hear the heavy thud of his feet turning at the end of the room and walking back. "No, you listen to me," he hissed, and his voice was vibrating with anger. "I told you I would handle it. She is totally out of it." I watched her look for her glasses for 20 minutes today, and they were on her head. I pressed the record button on the dictaphone, and the tiny wheels began to turn in silence. I leaned my head closer to the wood of the doorframe. "I need 2 more days," he said, and there was a pause as he listened to the person on the other end. "No, don't send him here yet. I need to get the signature first. If you send Mercer now, it will spook her. She might be old, but she is stubborn." Mercer. I filed the name away in my memory. Mercer was the money, or perhaps the buyer. I heard Elias stop pacing. He must have been standing right on the other side of the door because his voice was suddenly very clear. "I have the notary lined up," he said. "A guy named Kowalski. He owes me a favor. He will stamp anything I put in front of him. We are doing it tomorrow afternoon. I will tell her it is just some insurance paperwork for the tractor. She won't even read it." My hand tightened around the recorder. Tomorrow afternoon. The timeline had just collapsed. I didn't have weeks or even days to figure this out. I had less than 12 hours before he tried to trick me into signing away my life. I know, Elias said, and his voice dropped to a whine. "Just have the wire transfer ready. Once I get that signature, I am heading straight to the airport. I am done with this place, and I am done with her." He let out a long sigh, and then I heard the beep of a call ending. I waited for the sound of him moving toward the bed, but instead, I heard footsteps coming toward the door. Panic surged through me. If he opened the door and found me standing there in my nightgown with a tape recorder, the game would be over. He would know I was lucid, and he would know I was dangerous. He might resort to physical force. I spun around and moved as fast as I dared back toward my room. I didn't worry about the squeaking floorboards now, I just needed distance. I slipped through my doorway and pulled the door almost shut just as the latch on the guest room clicked open. I dove into bed and pulled the quilt up to my chin and shoved the recorder under my pillow. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced my breathing to slow down. I heard his footsteps pause in the hallway. He was listening. The house was silent again, but the silence felt charged with electricity. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute, I heard him retreat to the bathroom. The water ran, and then the door clicked shut. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I had the name of the notary, Kowalski. And I knew the deadline, tomorrow afternoon. The trap was set, but now I knew exactly where the trigger was. I lay there, clutching the recorder under the pillow like a weapon. He thought I wouldn't read the papers. He thought I was a helpless old woman. Tomorrow, I would show him that he had severely underestimated Beatrice Rossi. The morning sun was blindingly bright when I walked into the kitchen, and I raised a hand to my forehead in a theatrical gesture of pain. Elias was already at the table scrolling through his phone with a thumb that moved like a piston. He looked up when I groaned, and I saw a flash of irritation cross his face before he smoothed it into a mask of concern. I told him that I had a migraine, the kind that feels like an ice pick behind the eyes, and that I had run out of my prescription medication. I made my voice tremble, and I slumped into a chair holding my head as if it were made of fragile glass. I told him the pharmacy was in St. Helena, which was a good 30-minute drive away, and I apologized profusely for being such a burden. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. He looked at the clock and tapped his foot impatiently, but then he smiled that oily smile and stood up. He said he would go because he wanted me to be comfortable, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. He was thinking that a sick and medicated aunt would be much easier to manipulate into signing papers later that afternoon. He took the keys to his rental car, and I watched through the lace curtains as he sped down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. As soon as his taillights disappeared around the bend, I dropped the act. I stood up straight, and the imaginary pain vanished. I moved with the efficiency of the reporter I used to be. I grabbed my purse and the keys to my old Ford pickup truck, which was parked in the barn out of sight. I didn't have much time. If he drove fast, he could be back in an hour. I needed to be back in 50 minutes. The truck engine coughed and sputtered before roaring to life, and I backed out of the barn with a spray of gravel. I took the back roads to the county seat, driving faster than I should have, but the adrenaline was pumping through my veins like high-octane fuel. The vineyards blurred past me in streaks of green and gold, but I didn't see them. I only saw the road ahead and the grim task that awaited me. The county clerk's office was a drab concrete building that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. It was a place where dreams were filed away in triplicate and where secrets were buried in cardboard boxes. I walked up to the counter, and the clerk was a young woman with tired eyes and chipping nail polish. I gave her my parcel number and asked to see any recent filings regarding the deed to Cielo Alto. She typed slowly on her keyboard, and every click sounded like a ticking clock in my ears. I tapped my fingers on the countertop and willed her to hurry. My eyes darted to the door, expecting Elias to walk in at any moment, even though I knew he was miles away. The paranoia was a cold sweat on the back of my neck. "Here it is," she said finally, and she sounded bored. "A notice of pendency was filed 2 days ago, and there is a power of attorney document scanned into the system, pending final notarization verification." My heart stopped. 2 days ago, he had started the process before he even arrived at my house. He had been planning this for weeks, perhaps months. "Can I see it?" I asked, and my voice was surprisingly steady. She turned the monitor toward me. I leaned in and squinted at the screen. There it was, a document granting Elias Thorne full legal authority over the assets of Beatrice Rossi due to incapacitation. And at the bottom of the page, there was a signature. It was my signature. I stared at the scrawl in black ink. It was a perfect forgery. He must have traced it from an old birthday card or a check I had sent him years ago. It looped and curved exactly the way I wrote my name, but I knew I had never signed this paper. "And here is the buyer information," she added, scrolling down. I looked at the name listed under the purchase agreement. Mercer Holdings, LLC. It was a shell company, the kind of faceless corporate entity that swallowed family farms and spat out luxury condos in strip malls. "I need a copy of this," I said. "I need a certified copy of everything." The printer whirred and groaned, and I felt like screaming at it to go faster. The clerk stamped the pages with a heavy thud that sounded like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. I took the warm papers and shoved them into my bag. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, hard fury. He wasn't just trying to trick me, he was trying to erase me. He was declaring me incapacitated, invalidating my mind and my agency so he could cash out. I walked out of the building, and the bright sunlight felt harsh and exposing. I checked my watch. I had been gone for 35 minutes. I had to drive back like a maniac to beat him home. The drive back was a blur. I rehearsed my plan in my head. I couldn't confront him yet. I needed to catch him in the act of the final fraud, the one he mentioned on the phone. The notarization. I needed him to think I was still the sheep waiting for the slaughter. I pulled the truck into the barn and killed the engine. The silence of the farm rushed back in. I ran to the house and kicked off my boots by the door and threw myself onto the sofa. I draped a blanket over my legs and practiced my sick face in the mirror above the mantelpiece. 5 minutes later, I heard the roar of his car coming up the driveway. I closed my eyes and let my breathing become shallow. The door opened and Elias walked in carrying a small white paper bag from the pharmacy. "I got your pills, Bea," he said, and his voice was thick with false cheer. I opened my eyes and looked at him. I saw the monster beneath the expensive suit and the greedy child behind the anxious smile. "Thank you, Elias," I whispered weakly, reaching out a trembling hand. "You are such a good boy." He smiled and handed me the bag. Neither of us said a word about the dirt on my tires or the fact that my cheeks were flushed with the wind of a high-speed drive. He thought he had won, but in my purse, tucked under the sofa cushion, I had the proof that would bury him. I sat on the sofa with the white pharmacy bag in my lap and watched Elias walk into the kitchen to pour himself another glass of water. He was humming a tune under his breath, which was a nervous habit he had since he was a teenager, and it grated on my nerves like sandpaper. I opened the bottle of pills he had bought and shook 2 into my palm. They were just aspirin, but to him, they represented my compliance and my frailty. When he turned his back to look out the window, I slipped the pills into the pocket of my cardigan and raised the glass of water to my lips, swallowing nothing but air. "I am going to lie down for a bit," I called out, and my voice sounded thin and wavering, even to my own ears. "The medicine makes me drowsy." "Good idea, Bea," he replied without turning around. "You rest up. We have that insurance man coming later, remember? To look at the tractor. You will need your energy for that." I walked down the hallway to my bedroom and closed the door with a soft click. As soon as the latch caught, I leaned against the wood and let out a shuddering breath. The urge to march back into the kitchen and slam the certified copies of the forgery onto the counter was almost overwhelming. I wanted to see the color drain from his face. I wanted to scream at him and tell him to get off my land and out of my life. I wanted the satisfaction of an immediate victory. But 40 years of journalism had taught me that immediate satisfaction is often the enemy of justice. If I confronted him now, he would panic. He might claim it was a misunderstanding, or worse, he might become violent. We were alone out here, miles from the nearest neighbor. He was a desperate man with gambling debts, and I was a 72-year-old woman. Physically, I could not win a fight. I needed a shield, and I needed a sword, and in the civilized world, those things are made of paper and laws. I moved to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone. My hands were steady now, focused by the plan forming in my mind. I dialed the number for Arthur Galloway. Arthur was my attorney and my friend for 3 decades. He was a man who argued with the tenacity of a bulldog and possessed a moral compass that pointed true north. If anyone could stop this legal nightmare, it was him. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I paced the small rug by my bed, counting the rings. "Pick up, Arthur. Pick up." Then came the click and the mechanical voice of his voicemail. "You have reached the office of Arthur Galloway. I am currently out of the country on a fly fishing trip in Patagonia and will be returning on the 15th. If this is an emergency, please contact my associate. I lowered the phone slowly, and the silence of the room felt deafening. The 15th was a week away. Patagonia might as well be on the moon. I was completely alone. The sheriff was an option, but Sheriff Miller was a man who needed hard evidence before he would intervene in what looked like a family dispute. If I called him now, Elias could claim I was confused or senile, and without the notary actually stamping the fraudulent document, it was just my word against his. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. They were wrinkled and spotted with age, but they were still strong. I had uncovered corruption in City Hall when I was 25. I had tracked down a cartel money launderer when I was 40. I had never needed a man to save me then, and I certainly didn't need one now. I stood up and walked to the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked tired. Her gray hair was messy, and her cardigan was buttoned wrong, but her eyes were clear. They were the eyes of a hunter. If the law couldn't be here to witness the crime, I would have to make sure the crime happened on my terms. I had to let him spring the trap. I had to let him bring the notary and put the pen in my hand. I had to let him think he had succeeded right up until the moment the handcuffs clicked. A knock on my door made me jump. "Bea, are you awake?" Elias called out softly. I cleared my throat and pitched my voice high and weak. "Yes, Elias. I am just resting." "Okay, well, the insurance guy is running early. He will be here in an hour. I just wanted to let you know so you can freshen up." I stared at the door. He was lying again. The notary wasn't running early. Elias was pushing the timeline because he was nervous. He wanted this done before I could clear my head or change my mind. "That is fine, dear," I called back. "I will be ready." I heard his footsteps retreat down the hall. I walked over to my desk and pulled out a fresh notepad. I needed to prepare. I needed to document everything that was about to happen. I wasn't just a victim in this story anymore. I was the witness, the prosecutor, and the judge. And court was about to be in session. I spent the next 40 minutes washing my face and changing into a fresh blouse. I chose a soft blue silk that made me look respectable, but perhaps a bit frail, which was exactly the image I needed to project. When I walked back out into the living room, the house felt different. The air was thick with a tension that pricked at my skin like static electricity. Elias was not in the living room, so I went into the kitchen to put the kettle on again because a cup of tea is the one weapon I can always rely on. I placed the kettle on the burner and turned the knob. Usually, there is a soft hiss of gas, followed by the click of the igniter, and then the blue bloom of flame. But this time, there was only silence. I turned the knob back and forth, but nothing happened. I frowned and checked the other burners. Dead. All of them were dead. I knelt down and opened the cabinet beneath the stove where the main gas valve was located. It had been turned to the off position. A gas valve does not turn itself off, and it certainly doesn't do so by accident. It requires a firm, deliberate hand. "Bea, what are you doing down there?" Elias asked from the doorway. I stood up slowly, my knees cracking in the silence. "The stove is not working, Elias. There is no gas." He walked over, shaking his head with a look of exaggerated pity that made my stomach turn. "Oh, that. I turned the main valve off, Bea. I had to." "You had to," I repeated, keeping my face blank. "Why?" "Because you left the burner on again," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if sharing a shameful secret. "I came in here 10 minutes ago, and the room smelled like gas. The flame was out, but the gas was running. It is dangerous, Bea. You could have blown the house up." I looked at him, and for a split second, I doubted myself. That is the insidiousness of his tactic. It targets the one fear we all have as we age, which is the fear that our minds are betraying us. But then I looked at the stove again. I had not used the stove since breakfast. I had used the electric kettle earlier. He was lying. He was planting seeds of doubt in my mind, hoping they would grow into a forest of incompetence. I don't remember leaving it on, I said softly, playing into his narrative. He sighed and put a hand on my shoulder, giving it a squeeze that felt more like a restraint than a comfort. That is the problem, Bea. You don't remember, just like you don't remember where you put your keys. My keys? I asked. Yes, your house keys. I found them in the refrigerator next to the milk jug. He reached into his pocket and pulled out my brass key ring, dangling it in front of my face like a hypnotist's watch. I stared at the keys. I had left them in the bowl by the door. I knew I had. I had seen them there when he came back from the pharmacy. He had moved them. He had turned off the gas. He was systematically altering my reality to make me feel small and broken. It was a cruel psychological game known as gaslighting, and seeing my own nephew play it with such casual cruelty broke something in my heart. The last vestige of family loyalty I held for him evaporated in that kitchen. I am sorry, Elias, I whispered, taking the keys. I must be more tired than I thought. You are not just tired, Bea, he said, and his voice was smooth and reasonable. You are slipping. And it is okay to admit that. That is why we are doing this paperwork today, so you don't have to worry about these things anymore, so you don't burn the house down by mistake. He was building his case. He wasn't just doing this to unsettle me. He was rehearsing the narrative he would tell the notary and the buyers. Beatrice Rossi is senile. Beatrice Rossi is a danger to herself. Beatrice Rossi needs a guardian. I looked down at the floor to hide the flash of cold, hard clarity in my eyes. He thought he was breaking me down, but he was actually sharpening my resolve. Every lie he told was another brick in the wall of evidence I was building against him. Why don't you go sit in the living room? He suggested, guiding me out of the kitchen. I will wait for the insurance man outside. You just relax. Don't touch anything, okay? I nodded meekly and shuffled toward the armchair. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap. I watched him walk out the front door to wait on the porch. As soon as he was gone, I reached into my pocket and touched the cold metal of the dictaphone. I had recorded the entire conversation. I had his voice on tape, claiming I left the gas on, when I knew for a fact I hadn't. He wanted a confused old woman. Well, I would give him the performance of a lifetime. I would be so confused and so frail that he wouldn't even see the knife until I had cut the strings he was trying to tie around me. The sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires announced their arrival long before the doorbell rang. I watched from the window as a sleek black sedan pulled up next to Elias's rental car. It was a car that belonged in the financial district of San Francisco, not on a dirt road in Napa Valley. A man stepped out, and he was not the sort of man who inspects tractors for insurance claims. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than my entire harvest, and his shoes were Italian leather that had never touched soil. This was Mercer. I took a deep breath and smoothed the front of my blue silk blouse. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly and relaxed the muscles in my face to create the slack-jawed expression of someone who is no longer entirely present. I was about to give the performance of my life. Elias opened the front door and ushered the man inside with a nervous energy that made him look like a golden retriever trying to please a wolf. "Aunt Bea, this is Mr. Clark from the insurance company," Elias said, and his voice was too loud, as if he were speaking to a child. "He is here to look over the property and the equipment." I blinked slowly and stared at the stranger's tie instead of his eyes. "The insurance man," I repeated vaguely. "Did you come about the roof? The roof leaks when it rains, you know." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, which were cold and calculating as they swept over the living room furniture. "No, ma'am, I am just here to check the assets, to make sure everything is in order." His voice was smooth, like polished stone. I gestured for them to sit at the dining table, where I had already set out a pot of tea and a plate of store-bought cookies. I poured the tea and allowed my hand to tremble just enough to spill a few drops into the saucer. "Oh, dear," I murmured, dabbing at the spill with a napkin. "I am so clumsy these days. I don't know what is wrong with me." "You are doing fine," Elias said quickly, and he exchanged a look with Mercer that spoke volumes. It was a look of shared contempt and impatience. They sat down, and Mercer placed a thick leather briefcase on the table right next to the sugar bowl. I shuffled toward the kitchen, telling them I needed to fetch more milk. As soon as I was out of their line of sight, I stopped and pressed my back against the wall. I held my breath and listened. "She is worse than you said," Mercer said, and his voice was low and hard. "Is she going to be a problem signing?" "She will sign whatever I put in front of her," Elias whispered back. "She trusts me, and she is scared. I convinced her she is losing her mind. She thinks she needs me to take over." "Good," Mercer replied. "My investors are anxious. We want to break ground on the resort by spring. If we don't get the title transfer today, the deal is off." I felt a cold fury rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. A resort. They were going to pave over 3 generations of Rossi history to build a spa for tourists. I walked back into the dining room carrying the milk jug. I moved slowly, shuffling my feet. As I approached the table, I pretended to stumble slightly, and I bumped against the table leg. "Oh my goodness," I cried out, gripping the edge of the table for support. "Careful, Bea," Elias snapped, reaching out to steady the teapot. In the confusion, Mercer had turned to look at me, and for a brief second, his attention was off his briefcase. It was unlatched. Through the gap in the leather, I saw a stack of papers. The top document was thick and cream-colored, and even upside down I recognized the layout. It was the power of attorney form. But underneath it was something else. A map. A blueprint labeled Cielo Alto Resort and Casino. I regained my balance and apologized profusely. "I am just so dizzy today," I said, clutching my head. "Maybe I should go lie down for a moment before we look at the tractor." "Yes, you should do that," Mercer said, and he sounded relieved to be rid of me. "You rest, Mrs. Rossi. We can handle the paperwork later." I nodded and turned away. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had seen enough. The enemy was inside the gates, and he had brought the invasion plans with him. I knew exactly where the documents were, and I knew they were waiting for the notary to arrive before they called me back out. I walked down the hall to my bedroom, but I didn't go inside. Instead, I went into the small laundry room adjacent to the kitchen. I needed to type. I needed to create the weapon that would destroy them. I had a plan that was so simple and so audacious that they would never see it coming. They expected a confused old woman who couldn't remember her own name. They were about to meet a journalist who knew how to edit a story. The screen door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the quiet house. I moved to the window and peered through the lace curtains, ensuring they were truly gone. Elias and Mercer were walking toward the north ridge, their heads bent together in conversation. Elias was gesturing wildly with his hands pointing at my vines as if he were already tearing them out by the roots, while Mercer nodded slowly, checking things off on a clipboard. They looked like vultures circling a carcass they believed was already dead. I didn't have much time. They would be at the ridge for 10 minutes, perhaps 15, if Elias was being particularly thorough in his sales pitch. I turned from the window and looked at the dining table. The thick leather briefcase sat there next to the sugar bowl, looking like a dark stain on my grandmother's tablecloth. It was the only thing in the room that didn't belong, and it radiated a sense of malice. I walked over to it, and my heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I am a woman who has held a steady microphone in the middle of a riot, and I would not tremble now. I pressed the brass latches on the briefcase. They clicked open with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. I lifted the lid. The smell of fresh ink and expensive paper wafted up. Inside, the documents were organized in neat stacks. I thumbed through them quickly, my eyes scanning for the legal headers. Title deeds, survey maps, soil reports. And there it was at the very bottom of the stack, protected by a clear plastic folder. Durable power of attorney. I slid it out. The paper felt heavy and official. I looked at the bottom of the page, and there it was again. Beatrice Rossi, written in blue ink. It was a terrifyingly accurate forgery. If I hadn't known better, I would have sworn I wrote it myself. This single piece of paper was the key to my prison. With this, Elias could sell the farm, empty my bank accounts, and commit me to a home without me having a say in the matter. I held the document in my hand and felt a wave of nausea, but I pushed it down. I didn't just want to steal it. I wanted to send a message. I wanted him to know exactly how much he had underestimated me. I reached into the pocket of my apron. Folded into a neat square was a piece of paper I had typed up on my old Olivetti typewriter 10 minutes ago while hiding in the laundry room. I unfolded it. It was typed on the same cream-colored bond paper as his legal documents, which I had pilfered from his printer tray earlier that morning. At a glance, it looked like a dense legal contract with paragraphs and headers. But if you read the text, it was not a transfer of assets. Title: Beatrice's Traditional Lasagna with Bechamel Sauce. Article 1. The Meat Sauce. Begin by sautéing the onions and garlic in olive oil until translucent. Article 2. The Assembly. Layer the noodles with generous amounts of ricotta and mozzarella, ensuring full coverage. I smiled a grim, tight smile. I slid the lasagna recipe into the plastic folder where the power of attorney had been. I placed it back at the bottom of the stack, exactly where he had left it. I closed the briefcase and snapped the latches shut. I took the forged power of attorney and walked quickly to the kitchen. I couldn't burn it yet, because I needed it as evidence. I couldn't throw it away. I opened the large ceramic jar on the counter labeled flour. I plunged my hand deep into the soft white powder, burying the document at the very bottom. No man like Elias ever looks inside a flour jar. It is a domestic object invisible to him. I dusted the flour from my hands and wiped the counter clean. I checked the clock. 8 minutes had passed. I returned to the living room and sat down in my armchair. I picked up my knitting needles and a half-finished scarf. I forced my breathing to slow down. I began to knit, counting the stitches in my head. Knit 1, purl 2. 2 minutes later, I heard their voices. The front door opened, and they walked in, bringing a gust of cold air with them. Elias looked flushed and triumphant. Mercer looked bored, but satisfied. "Everything looks to be in order," Mercer said, picking up his briefcase. He didn't open it. He just felt the weight of it in his hand and nodded. Elias beamed at me. "See, Aunt Bea, that wasn't so bad, was it? Mr. Mercer is very impressed with the property." I looked up and blinked my eyes confusedly. "Did you fix the roof?" I asked in a trembling voice. Elias laughed and patted my hand in a way that was meant to be comforting, but felt patronizing. "No, Bea. But don't you worry. We are going to fix everything. The notary will be here in an hour to stamp the papers, and then everything will be taken care of." He looked at the briefcase in Mercer's hand, and then he looked at me. He had no idea. He thought he was holding the keys to the kingdom, but he was holding instructions for pasta. "That sounds nice, dear," I said, returning to my knitting. "I am getting hungry. Perhaps I will make lasagna for dinner." Elias rolled his eyes at Mercer, clearly thinking I was rambling about food again. But Mercer just checked his watch. "1 hour," he said. "I will wait in the car to make some calls." As the door closed behind Mercer, Elias turned to me, his face glowing with greed. "Almost there, Bea. Almost there." "Yes, Elias," I thought, as the needles clicked softly in my hands. "You are almost there indeed." The hour passed with agonizing slowness, and I sat in my chair, knitting row after row of gray wool, while the grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the seconds of Elias's freedom. Outside, the wind had picked up and was rattling the window panes, which seemed fitting for the storm that was about to break inside the house. I watched Elias pacing the floorboards. He was checking his phone every 30 seconds and wiping his palms on his trousers. He was nervous. He knew that what he was about to do was a felony, and deep down beneath the layers of greed and entitlement, he was terrified. Finally, the sound of a heavy car door slamming announced the arrival of the final player in this farce. The front door opened and a man walked in who looked like he had been cut from the same cloth as a cheap suit. He was short and balding, with a face that was red from too much alcohol and eyes that were watery and weak. He carried a rubber stamp in his pocket like it was a badge of office. This was Kowalski, the notary. "Sorry I'm late," he mumbled, not looking at me. "Traffic on the bridge." "It doesn't matter," Elias said quickly, ushering him to the table. "You are here now. Let's get this done. Mr. Mercer is waiting in the car and we have a schedule to keep." Elias pulled out a chair for Kowalski and then turned to me. His voice dropped to that sickly sweet tone he used when he wanted something. "Come on over, Aunt Bea. Just a few formalities and then you can go back to your knitting. We just need to verify that signature." I set my knitting down slowly and stood up. I walked to the table and took the seat opposite Kowalski. I looked at Elias. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He reached for the leather briefcase that was still sitting by the sugar bowl. He unsnapped the latches and threw the lid back. The smell of victory must have been intoxicating to him because he didn't even look down at first. He just reached into the stack of papers and pulled out the clear plastic folder from the bottom. "Here it is," he said, sliding it across the table toward the notary. "The durable power of attorney, signed and dated." Kowalski pushed his glasses up his nose and reached for the folder. He opened it and pulled out the cream-colored sheet of paper. He raised his stamp ready to make the theft official. "Wait a minute," Kowalski said, pausing with the stamp hovering in mid-air. "What is it?" Elias snapped, impatience flaring in his eyes. "Just stamp it." Kowalski squinted at the paper. "This isn't a legal document." Elias laughed a harsh barking sound. "Of course it is. I printed it myself." "Look at the header." "I am looking at the header," Kowalski said, and he looked up at Elias with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "It says Beatrice's traditional lasagna with bechamel sauce." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the ticking of the clock. Elias froze. His face went pale and then flushed a deep, violent red. "What are you talking about? Give me that." He snatched the paper from Kowalski's hand. His eyes scanned the text and I watched as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. He read the ingredients list. He read the instructions for sautéing onions. He flipped the page over looking for the legal jargon, but there was only a tip about adding extra mozzarella. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Where is the—" He looked at the briefcase. He frantically tore through the rest of the papers, throwing soil reports and maps onto the floor. He shook the empty plastic folder. The power of attorney was gone. I leaned forward in my chair. I let the slack expression drop from my face like a heavy curtain falling. I straightened my spine and looked him dead in the eye. The confused old woman vanished, and Beatrice Rossi, the investigative journalist, took her place. "It calls for fresh basil, Elias," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Dried basil just doesn't have the same punch, and you really must watch the bechamel sauce or it will burn." Elias stared at me. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the recipe in his hand, and then back at me, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. "You," he gasped. "You switched it." I smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I was so far gone that I wouldn't recognize my own name being forged on a document to sell my home?" "You are senile," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are crazy. You don't know what you are doing." I stood up and walked around the table until I was standing right next to him. "I am not senile, Elias. I am disappointed. I watched you grow up. I held you when you were a baby. And now you come into my house and try to steal the only thing I have left." I turned to Kowalski, who was already packing his stamp away, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. "I suggest you leave, Mr. Kowalski," I said. "Unless you want to be an accessory to fraud. I have the original forgery secured in a safe place, and I have a recording of my nephew conspiring to have you notarize it without my consent." Kowalski didn't say a word. He bolted for the door, and I heard his car peeling out of the driveway seconds later. Elias was breathing hard, his chest heaving. He looked at the scattered papers on the floor, and then at me. The mask of the loving nephew was gone completely. In its place was something feral and dangerous. "Give me the paper, Bea," he hissed, stepping toward me. "Give me the real document. Now." I stood my ground. The game was over, but the danger was just beginning. The room seemed to shrink around us, and the air was sucked out by the vacuum of his rage. Elias took a step toward me, and for the first time in my life, I saw the violence that lived inside him. It wasn't the calculated cruelty of a con man anymore. It was the raw desperation of a cornered animal. He looked at the door where the notary had fled, and then he looked back at me, and I saw the decision form in his eyes. He realized that persuasion was over and that force was his only remaining currency. He moved quickly, cutting off my path to the hallway. He loomed over me, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Where is it, Bea?" he said, and his voice was a low growl that vibrated in his chest. "I am not playing games with you. Give me the document, and maybe I won't have to hurt you." I stood very still. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a hammer, but I forced my face to remain like carved stone. I had faced down men much scarier than Elias Thorne in my career. I had stared down Union busters on the docks of Oakland, and I had interviewed murderers in San Quentin. I knew that showing fear now would be like bleeding in shark-infested waters. "You are not going to hurt me, Elias," I said calmly, holding his gaze. "Because if you touch a single hair on my head, you will spend the rest of your life in a cell. And frankly, you do not have the constitution for prison." He laughed a jagged, hysterical sound. "Who is going to stop me?" "We are miles from anyone. I can tear this house apart until I find that paper. And then I can tell everyone you fell down the stairs." "Who are they going to believe? The grieving nephew or the senile old woman who leaves the gas on?" He reached out and grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh through the silk of my blouse, and it was painful, but I didn't flinch. I looked down at his hand and then back up at his face. They will believe the tape I said. He froze. What tape? I reached into the pocket of my cardigan with my free hand and pulled out the old Sony dictaphone. I held it up so he could see the red light that had been blinking steadily since he walked in with the notary. I have recorded everything, Elias. I have you conspiring with the notary. I have you admitting to the gas leak lie. I have you threatening me just now. And this device is not the only copy. I uploaded the audio to a cloud server 10 minutes ago while I was in the laundry room. He released my arm as if I were burning hot metal. He stared at the recorder in my hand, and the color drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and sickly. The arrogance evaporated and was replaced by a dawn of absolute terror. You couldn't have, he stammered. You don't know how to use the cloud. I smiled cold and sharp. I was using technology to expose corruption before you were born, Elias. Do not mistake age for incompetence. He stumbled back, hitting the edge of the table. He looked around the room as if searching for an exit that didn't lead to ruin. Then he looked at the window. I am leaving, he said, his voice cracking. I am taking the car. You can't stop me. He turned to run, but before he could take a step, the room was suddenly bathed in a wash of red and blue light. The colors pulsed through the lace curtains dancing across the walls and illuminating the panic on his face. I didn't just call the notary, Elias, I said softly. I called Sheriff Miller an hour ago. I told him I had an intruder who was trying to rob me. I told him to come in quietly. The sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel outside broke the spell. Then came the sharp, authoritative rap on the front door. Sheriff's Department, open up, shouted a voice I knew well. It was Tom Miller. Elias slumped against the wall. The fight went out of him all at once, leaving him looking small and pathetic. He wasn't a mastermind or a tycoon. He was just a sad, greedy boy who had gambled and lost. The front door swung open, and Sheriff Miller stepped in, his hand resting on his holster. He looked at Elias, cowering by the table, and then he looked at me, standing tall in the center of the room. Everything all right here, Beatrice? He asked, his eyes scanning the scene. I smoothed down the sleeve of my blouse where Elias had grabbed me. I am fine, Tom, I said. But I believe you need to arrest this man for attempted fraud, elder abuse, and assault. I have the evidence right here. I handed the dictaphone to the sheriff. Elias didn't fight as the deputy stepped in and pulled his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. It was the sound of a story finding its ending. It was the sound of justice. The flashing lights of the patrol cars finally faded into the darkness, leaving the driveway silent once again. I watched from the porch as the taillights disappeared around the bend, taking my nephew and his greed away to a place where he would have plenty of time to think about his choices. Sheriff Miller had stayed behind for a few minutes to take my statement and to assure me that an APB had been put out for Mercer and his shell company. He told me that they had been tracking Mercer for months on similar charges in Oregon and that my recording was the final nail in their coffin. When Tom Miller left, he tipped his hat to me and gave me a look that was a mixture of respect and disbelief. He told me that I was the most dangerous 72-year-old he had ever met. I took it as a compliment. I walked back into the house, and the silence was no longer heavy or threatening. It felt clean. I went into the kitchen and saw the mess on the floor where Elias had scattered the papers in his panic. I would clean that up tomorrow. Tonight, I had one final piece of business to attend to. I walked over to the counter and opened the large ceramic flour jar. I plunged my hand into the soft, cool powder, and my fingers brushed against the plastic folder. I pulled it out and dusted it off. There it was, the durable power of attorney with my forged signature. It was a piece of paper that had almost cost me everything. It represented the lie that I was weak and the lie that I was finished. I walked to the living room where the fireplace was cold and dark. I struck a match and held the flame to the corner of the document. The paper curled and blackened, and the fire ate the lie hungrily. I watched until the signature turned to ash and crumbled into the grate. It was done. Cielo Alto was safe, and so was I. I felt a sudden wave of exhaustion, but it was a good kind of tired. It was the exhaustion of a harvest well gathered. I went to the wine rack and pulled down a bottle of the 2015 Cabernet. This was a vintage we had made during a drought year. Everyone said the grapes would shrivel and die, but they hadn't. They had dug their roots deeper into the earth seeking water in the bedrock, and the wine they produced was complex and robust and unyielding. I poured a glass and walked out onto the porch. The night air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. I sat in my rocking chair and looked out over the vineyards. The moonlight turned the rows of vines into silver ribbons stretching out into the dark. I thought about Elias and the look on his face when he realized he had lost. He had looked at me and seen only wrinkles and gray hair. He saw a relic. He saw a mark. He forgot that to get to this age, you have to survive. You have to survive heartbreaks and wars and recessions and loss. You have to build a shell that is hard enough to withstand the weather, but soft enough to let the sun in. We are not invisible. We are not fragile. We are the survivors of 1,000 battles that the young know nothing about. Elias thought he was fighting a little old lady who knit scarves. He didn't realize he was fighting the matriarch of the Rossi line, and the land always protects its own. I raised my glass to the moon and to the silent vines. I took a sip, and the taste was rich with blackberries and oak and the deep iron of the soil. It tasted like victory. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Do you believe that family should always be forgiven, or are there some betrayals that break the bond of blood forever? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.